Certain designs possess an inherent timelessness, much like the formidable steel helmet that safeguarded countless soldiers or the iconic Colt. 45 pistol capable of halting even the most determined charges. Yet, this particular sidearm, with its sturdy, almost blocky frame, appeared an unlikely contender for heroism during the Second World War. Conceived in 1911, its considerable weight often dragged at the belts of Marines and soldiers alike as they slogged through the relentless mud, sweat, and corrosive salt air of the Pacific. In an era of streamlined, powerful rifles that commanded the battlefields, the Colt 45 struck many observers, particularly the Japanese imperial troops, as an antiquated relic rather than a genuine threat. They openly derided it, scoffing at what they considered an obsolete American plaything, a mere souvenir from an earlier conflict. Amidst the sweltering intensity of the Pacific theater, where bayonets glinted menacingly and dense bamboo thickets seemed to consume men whole, the pistol appeared little more than a cumbersome, decorative accessory dangling from a soldier's hip. However, the resounding crack of a single gunshot possesses a chilling ability to silence and transmute mockery into stark realization. The Pacific theater, however, harbored no space for pleasant illusions. It was a realm of brutal, unforgiving realities. Oppressive jungle humidity permeated every object, causing rifles to swell with corrosive moisture and boots to disintegrate long before the resolve of the men who wore them. Here, soldiers battled not only a tenacious enemy, but also the very land itself, where mosquitoes assailed them with the relentless persistence of bullets. Into this savage crucible, the Japanese forces advanced, their confidence bolstered by an unwavering discipline and a deep-seated martial tradition. Their Arisaka rifles, distinguished by their considerable length and robust construction, provided a significant advantage in open engagements. Moreover, their formidable bayonets, often extending beyond the length of their adversaries' entire rifles, became potent symbols of their unwavering ferocity. A profound belief that raw spirit and sharp steel would invariably triumph. From this perspective, the Colt 45 appeared to them as little more than a secondary, almost dismissible item, a weapon for those perceived as too feeble to confront a charge head-on with cold, gleaming steel. Japanese soldiers frequently sneered, labeling Americans as excessively dependent on their machinery. They confidently predicted that in the inevitable chaos of close-quarters combat, when rifles invariably jammed or ammunition for grenades ran dry, American troops would find themselves utterly exposed, with only a diminutive pistol to guard them from certain death. Yet the Colt 45 was far from an ordinary sidearm. It harbored a formidable secret. Each of its rounds was significantly heavier, larger, and more inherently punishing than the slender cartridges found in most European pistols of the era. When unleashed, the weapon emitted a guttural roar, a distinct, sharp crack that resonated uniquely through the dense jungle foliage, an unmistakable voice of authority. Initially, however, the Japanese failed to truly hear this voice. They merely observed its apparent bulk, mocked the considerable weight that visibly strained American belts, and whispered among themselves that no truly civilized army would ever rely on such an antiquated, cumbersome implement. For American soldiers, conversely, the pistol embodied a profoundly different significance. It was never considered a mere ornament. Instead, it represented an ultimate safeguard, a solemn, final promise that amidst the swirling chaos of a charging enemy or the suffocating darkness of a foxhole, a soldier would never be left entirely defenseless. It was on Guadalcanal in 1942, the site of the first monumental clash between U.S. and Japanese ground forces, that this derisive laughter reached its most cutting intensity. Japanese patrols openly jeered at the sight of American Marines meticulously oiling their sidearms, spreading tales that these American pistols would inevitably falter in the unforgiving muck, deeming them far better suited for saloon brawls than for the brutal realities of tropical warfare. The Marines, often weary, underfed, and perpetually on edge, caught wind of these rumors, relayed by captured prisoners or pieced together from fragmented translations. Some among them responded with bitter, tight-lipped grins, choosing to let the enemy indulge in their misconceptions. Others, however, harbored quiet anxieties, wondering if perhaps their pistols genuinely were too archaic, too cumbersome, or simply too clumsy for the grueling battles that lay ahead. After all, weapons accrued reputations, and these reputations held the power to either bolster a man's courage or subtly erode his nerve. Yet, history consistently demonstrates that even the most deeply entrenched reputations are ultimately reshaped by lived experience. One particular evening, as elongated shadows stretched across the swaying palm trees and the incessant chorus of crickets momentarily overshadowed the distant crackle of gunfire, a young Marine named Charles Evans meticulously cleaned his Colt. His fingers moved with the practiced, almost instinctual rhythm of a sacred ritual. The slide drawn back, the chamber thoroughly inspected, the barrel carefully wiped clean. Around him, older, more seasoned Marines smoked in contemplative silence. One veteran leaned in, his voice a low mutter. "They laugh now. Let them. They'll learn soon enough." Evans cast his gaze down at the pistol. It was certainly not an object of beauty. Its once pristine finish had been dulled by the corrosive salt air, its grip smoothed and worn by the countless hands that had held it. Yet, in its substantial weight, he perceived an unwavering steadfastness, an immovable core, as if the weapon itself possessed a stubborn refusal to succumb to doubt. He couldn't help but wonder if that intrinsic defiance would truly make a difference when the jungle inevitably erupted into violence once more. The Japanese, in their derision, scoffed not merely at the physical pistol but at the very ethos it represented, the notion that technology, rather than indomitable spirit, might determine survival. Their ingrained doctrine revered the terrifying Banzai charge, an overwhelming surge characterized by the synchronized roar of hundreds of voices and the fearsome glint of countless blades sweeping forward. In such frenzied, decisive moments, rifles transformed into crude pikes, and pistols appeared ludicrously insignificant. What, after all, could a mere 7-inch barrel accomplish against 100 men hurtling through the oppressive darkness? They laughed precisely because they were utterly incapable of envisioning the impending, brutal answer. That answer, however, was rooted in the unyielding laws of physics, in the raw, undeniable truth of velocity and impact. 45 caliber round, heavy and wide, delivered a devastating force specifically engineered to halt, to incapacitate completely, rather than merely wound. Its efficacy was not about graceful design. It was about absolute finality. Even while Japanese officers contemptuously dismissed the Colt 45, American commanders harbored a profound understanding of its intrinsic value. Decades of operational reports, spanning from early conflicts in the Philippines against fiercely determined Moro warriors to the churned, muddy fields of World War I, had consistently reaffirmed the pistol's formidable worth. It had been specifically engineered as a direct response to these fanatical combatants, men who had famously charged through volleys of smaller caliber fire utterly unfazed, necessitating a heavier, more conclusive impact to be stopped. This potent history traveled invisibly with every holstered pistol across the vast expanse of the Pacific. While few individual Marines might have been aware of the precise historical details, many instinctively sensed the profound weight of this legacy within their sidearms, an unspoken assurance that this very weapon had confronted doubt countless times before, and just as often had definitively silenced it. Within the American camps, a veneer of rough humor often masked an underlying unease. "She kicks like a mule," a Marine might quip, shaking his wrist with feigned pain after a firing session, adding with a grim nod, "But if she hits, you won't need a second shot." Laughter would ripple through the ranks, but it was the laughter of men steeling themselves, a means of collective reassurance, never one of genuine underestimation. Across the lines, however, Japanese troops' laughter resonated with a starkly different cadence. Mocking, derisive, profoundly rooted in their unwavering conviction that their innate courage and superior steel would invariably eclipse any mere American contraption. The air separating the two opposing armies was thick with the distinct sounds of mirth, yet it was a dangerously fragile sound, utterly destined to shatter. As night cloaked Guadalcanal, the jungle itself seemed to grow restless, a living entity holding its breath. The moon retreated, obscured by errant, drifting clouds, and from somewhere beyond the defensive wire, a murmur of voices began to coalesce. Marines tightened their grips on their rifles, their grenades, and their pistols. Charles Evans's thumb instinctively brushed the safety catch of his Colt. 45, a faint click distinguishing readiness from hesitation. He could almost discern the phantom echo of the Japanese laughter, still lingering faintly in his memory, as if taunting him from the deepening shadows. His mind conjured images of distant bayonets, gleaming in the darkness, and the unwavering discipline of men who truly believed his humble pistol to be an utter joke. The night deepened ominously, bringing with it the low, guttural chant of a charge beginning to gather momentum. The enemy's laughter had reverberated far and wide, but soon, so too would the gunfire. And when the very first shot ripped through the tropical air, it would not be a rifle or a glinting bayonet that provided the answer. It would be the savage, guttural bark of a pistol once contemptuously dismissed. Its profound echo would cleave cleanly through the cacophony, transmuting confident expectation into raw, visceral shock. In that precise, explosive moment, all laughter would cease. Not because any command was issued, but because the Colt 45 would eloquently speak for itself, and once it had spoken, the dense jungle would forever lose its former sound. The true baptism of fire arrived within the dripping, oppressive jungles of Guadalcanal, where the scornful laughter that had once emanated from enemy lines abruptly dissolved into the raw, all-encompassing roar of battle. The Marines, who had endured such derision for their ostensibly heavy pistols, now clutched these very weapons in fists slick with nervous sweat, their ears assaulted by the deafening symphony of incessant insects, shattering gunfire, and the primal, guttural cries of men surging through the tangled canopy of trees. It was August 1942, and the Japanese imperial forces, resolute in their determination to drive the Americans back into the sea, unleashed wave after relentless wave of infantry across the treacherous, tangled terrain. Their aggressive doctrine prioritized sheer shock and overwhelming speed, with bayonets fixed and voices raised in furious Banzai shouts, strategically designed to shatter enemy morale even before physical contact. Yet, within the suffocating undergrowth, where oppressive shadows swallowed any sense of distance and cumbersome rifles constantly snagged on unseen branches and vines, combat was not waged across 50 yards. Here it was a brutal, intimate struggle, fought at mere 5 paces. Charles Evans, the young Marine who had earlier wrestled with doubts about the utility of his sidearm, now hunkered deep within his foxhole as the night vibrated violently with the ceaseless roar of battle. His trusty Springfield rifle lay close beside him, its barrel already steaming faintly from the relentless heat of repeated volleys. The bolt felt stubbornly stiff, and his shoulder throbbed with a searing ache from the punishing recoil of too many rounds discharged in frantic haste. Around him, the entire line strained under immense pressure, men desperately firing wild bursts at fleeting shadows darting between the dense trees. He distinctly heard a comrade's frustrated curse as a jammed rifle clicked uselessly, the sound instantly devoured by the engulfing chaos. In that desperate instant, Evans's hand reached instinctively for the Colt 45 at his hip. The very weight he had once resented, now paradoxically, became his anchor, providing a profound, steadying reassurance. When the Japanese charge finally shattered against their beleaguered position, it was not the formidable reach of their long rifles that ultimately saved them. Instead, shadowy figures burst explosively from the oppressive darkness, their bayonets glinting menacingly, their feet pounding relentlessly on the soft, damp earth. Evans squeezed the trigger of his pistol, the muzzle flash momentarily searing his strained night vision. The heavy .45 slug found its mark squarely in the lead attacker, whose body crumpled mid-stride with a sickening thud that visibly jarred the ground. Another enemy soldier lunged forward, blade raised high, and again Evans fired once then twice. The recoil was sharp and jarring, but the effect was horrifyingly immediate. The man collapsed utterly before his momentum could carry him even another step forward. In those raw, breathless seconds, Evans absorbed a lesson that no tactical lecture could ever impart. The Colt. 45 did not merely require respect to prove its efficacy. It unequivocally demanded it. The Japanese had initially scoffed because they implicitly believed their long rifles conferred superior range, and their formidable bayonets, an unmatched courage. Yet, the Pacific theater bore no resemblance to the open battlefields of France in 1918. Here, the dense, suffocating jungle compressed men into brutal proximity, irrevocably transforming what might have been firefights into savage knife fights, and converting skilled riflemen into desperate brawlers. Pistols, once condescendingly relegated to secondary status, now rapidly ascended to become indispensable primary tools of survival. Marines found that whether they were clearing confined dugouts, stumbling blindly through treacherous vines, or wrestling in the clinging mud, the Colt's profound, heavy bark could decisively end a struggle in a mere heartbeat. Its ammunition was undeniably limited, just 7 rounds in a magazine. But each and every one of those rounds represented an unyielding promise, final and utterly absolute. From these harrowing clashes, reports began to filter back, small, intense stories recounted by weary, hushed voices. Tales of a resolute lieutenant whose pistol single-handedly saved a vital machine gun nest when Japanese infantry unexpectedly breached their lines. Of a radio operator who, armed with only his sidearm, courageously fended off a sudden, furious bayonet rush. And even Evans himself, whose hands trembled not from residual fear, but from the strange, profound, and almost terrifying realization that his very survival was owed to the fact that his pistol had spoken first. These raw, unfiltered accounts meticulously stitched together a new, unassailable reputation for the Colt, one that no enemy propaganda could ever hope to erase. The pistol, once ridiculed as an outdated relic, now commanded hushed whispers of awe and newfound respect. Yet, this burgeoning awe was invariably tempered with a pervasive sense of unease. Soldiers understood implicitly that the Colt was no gentle companion. Its powerful recoil routinely bruised palms, its concussive report instantly deafened ears in confined spaces, and its persistent weight continually dragged at the belt, a constant physical reminder. Some men still cursed it under their breath, but never with genuine conviction. A Marine might complain about its drawbacks, but he would also meticulously check its magazine twice before the encroaching night, his fingers instinctively brushing the cold steel like a protective talisman. In the claustrophobic confines of foxholes, men exchanged stories of the Colt's legendary power, often embellishing for the sake of dark humor, yet always rooted in an undeniable truth. "She'll knock a man clean out of his shoes," one Marine would swear, and while laughter inevitably followed, no one, deep down, ever doubted the essential truth of the claim. The Japanese, too, began to observe this shift with growing disquiet. Prisoners captured during the campaign would mutter uneasily about the American sidearm, their initial contempt replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. In retrieved diaries, Japanese officers articulated their astonishment, describing comrades felled instantly by single pistol shots. Their palpable disbelief was evident in their words. Astonishment that a weapon ostensibly so small could halt a furious charge with such absolute finality. For a warrior culture that profoundly revered the bayonet and the sword as direct extensions of a soldier's intrinsic spirit, the Colt represented something profoundly alien, something brutally effective and utterly undeniable. It was not about noble, artisanal steel. It was about cold, stark, mechanical certainty. Even so, the Marines themselves never succumbed to romanticizing the Colt. They dwelled too intimately with death to indulge in comforting myths. For them, the pistol was simply a starkly practical tool. It was the absolute last resort, the weapon one instinctively reached for when a rifle inevitably jammed, when the suffocating jungle devoured all light, or when a shadowy figure abruptly lunged from the tangled vines. Evans, for his part, found himself cleaning his Colt more frequently than his primary rifle, not out of any deep affection, but from sheer, undeniable necessity. Each time he meticulously reassembled it, he was haunted by the visceral memory of bodies collapsing in the dark, a memory that carried both the profound relief of survival and the crushing weight of its cost. He no longer harbored any doubt about the pistol's efficacy, but he could never quite forget the terrible implications of the belief he had placed in it. As the arduous Guadalcanal campaign relentlessly dragged on, the pistol gradually evolved into a quiet yet potent equalizer. Marines, frequently caught under furious assault in the desolate, black hours before dawn, came to trust that even when all else failed, they could still fiercely retaliate with its 7 heavy rounds. The very weapon that had been so derided now represented the critical, thin line separating agonizing survival from absolute silence. The once mocking laughter of the Japanese had completely evaporated from the jungle, supplanted instead by their harrowing cries as their desperate charges collided with relentless gunfire, and by the sickening thud of bodies striking the clinging mud. For the Americans, this represented a grim, hard-won vindication. Yet, as history repeatedly proves, vindication in the brutal crucible of war is invariably a fragile and fleeting state. Evans would later confide in a letter sent home, a stark observation. The pistol performs its grim duty, but you never truly stop hearing its echo. This echo was far more than a mere sound. It was the indelible memory of abrupt endings, of the razor-sharp line between living and dying, irrevocably drawn by the decisive pull of a trigger. The Colt certainly instilled a profound sense of confidence, but it simultaneously demanded a heavy reckoning. Men who fired it carried away not only their own survival but also the haunting, indelible memory of those it had dispatched with such stark finality. The merciless jungle, in its own brutal way, had baptized them in this undeniable truth. By the time much-needed reinforcements finally reached Guadalcanal, the island was grimly littered with the grim remnants of failed charges and utterly shattered illusions. The pistol that had once been the object of such ridicule now possessed an irrefutable reputation, forged in the searing heat of combat and carved deep in sweat and blood. Soldiers no longer questioned its essential presence. They trusted it implicitly, with the same unwavering faith they placed in their helmets and their boots. Evans, once a skeptic, now instinctively touched the worn grip with an unconscious reverence, born not of pride, but of profound recognition. The weapon had, beyond any shred of doubt, proven its indispensable worth. Yet, Guadalcanal was merely the prologue. Countless other islands lay in wait, each harboring its own treacherous jungles, labyrinthine caves, and desperate, suicidal charges. Each subsequent engagement would test the pistol anew, propelling its burgeoning legend further still. Evans understood this chilling reality as he sat one quiet dawn, meticulously reloading his magazines by the pale, fading light of a retreating moon. He recalled the mocking laughter that had once derided his weapon and wondered how many enemy voices would still dare to utter such scorn when the relentless campaign swept to the next blood-soaked shore. The Colt was unequivocally no longer a joke. It was a definitive answer. But the brutal war was far from its conclusion, and the questions that lay ahead would prove deadlier still. The war, a relentless, grinding leviathan, showed no signs of abating after Guadalcanal. Victory on one bloodied island served only to unlock the gates to another, and the Marines, bearing their emotional and physical scars like indelible ink, pressed ever onward. The Colt, 45, once the subject of such dismissive mockery, now traveled with them as an utterly proven and indispensable companion. Aboard the troop transport ships charting courses for the unforgiving shores of Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, men adjusted their holsters with a familiarity that bordered on sacred ritual. The pistol, in their minds, had transcended its role as a mere backup weapon. It had become an existential extension of their very survival. Charles Evans, now far from the hesitant boy who had once harbored doubts about his sidearm, meticulously checked his magazines with a soldier's ingrained superstition, as if ensuring that each precious round was a solemn promise he might soon be compelled to redeem. The relentless Pacific campaign had solidified into an island-to-island crucible, and the Colt's powerful, resonant voice would inevitably echo within each blazing furnace. Tarawa, in November 1943, starkly illustrated the terrifying intimacy combat could achieve. The atoll itself, a mere 2 miles long, was a desolate speck of coral, heavily encrusted with formidable Japanese fortifications. Marines waded ashore through churning, waist-deep water, weighed down by sodden packs and relentless enemy fire, as merciless machine guns raked the surf around them. Many brave men never even reached the blood-soaked sand. Those who miraculously did found themselves immediately crawling into bunkers so claustrophobically tight that their long rifles became unwieldy burdens. Grenades were hurled in first, and once the acrid smoke cleared, it was the pistols that led the way into the breach. Evans watched, transfixed, as a corporal beside him smoothly drew his Colt, its black frame glinting briefly in the harsh sun, and fired decisively into a shadowy dugout where movement stirred. The resulting roar was deafening, reverberating violently in the confined space. When a fragile silence finally descended, the corporal muttered without looking up, "The rifles are for the beach. The pistols are for the war." It was not a boast born of bravado, but a chilling, profound recognition of an undeniable truth. By Saipan in June 1944, that hard-won recognition had solidified into an unwritten doctrine. The Japanese forces, with tenacious resolve, fought not only above ground but also deeply entrenched below, within the labyrinthine network of caves that honeycombed the volcanic hills. Here, rifles were simply too cumbersome to maneuver effectively, and bayonets proved utterly useless in the impenetrable darkness. Marines adapted by crawling forward in pairs. One gripped a trembling flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive gloom, while the other moved with a pistol raised and ready. Evans himself carried his Colt into one such cavern, the air thick and heavy with the acrid scent of sulfur and the sweat of fear. He fired blindly at barely discernible shapes, muzzle flashes briefly painting the damp rock walls in violent bursts of orange. Each shot was not merely a defensive act. It was an absolute necessity, creating a fleeting moment's margin between his life and the unseen blade of an enemy lurking mere inches away. The Japanese had indeed ceased their laughter. Captured journals now spoke of the heavy American pistol with a blend of grudging awe and bitter resentment. "It kills with one strike," one officer had meticulously scrawled, his script shaky but chillingly clear. They had, at last, come to fully grasp what Evans and his comrades had already learned through brutal experience. In the tight, choking confines of island warfare, sheer physical size and stopping power mattered immensely, and the .45 delivered a definitive finality that no smaller round could possibly replicate. The very men who had once sneered at the weapon now openly feared its undeniable authority. Yet such profound authority inevitably came at a heavy cost. At Peleliu, in September 1944, where the brutal coral ridges seemed to turn a permanent red beneath the relentless sun, Evans witnessed firsthand the psychological toll the pistol exacted on the human mind. He had been forced to employ his sidearm 3 times in a single day, each engagement at such a terrifyingly close distance that he could discern the whites of another man's eyes. The searing memory clung to him with the oppressive stickiness of the island's heat. That night, with a hollow expression, he meticulously wiped the pistol clean with slow, deliberate care. To trust this weapon was also to grimly accept the terrible actions it demanded. The Colt was undeniably reliable, unflinching in its performance, but it offered absolutely no room for comforting illusions. Each round was a definitive full stop, never a lingering question mark. The men now spoke of it with a markedly different tone. There was less gallows humor, fewer exaggerated boasts. They carried it with a quiet, almost reverent respect, not unlike the way a priest might safeguard a sacred relic. Machine gunners swore by its life-saving power. Officers proudly bore it like a personal badge of honor, and even riflemen, previously dismissive, now envied those who had been issued one. In moments of tense respite, the grim stories circulated endlessly. How a lone pistol had valiantly saved a foxhole, how a single sergeant had miraculously held off an entire charge with just 7 rounds, or how, in the impenetrable blackness of a cave, the Colt's guttural voice had delivered the absolute last word. The weapon had profoundly transcended its role as a mere tool. It had irrevocably become an intrinsic part of the campaign's harrowing mythology, irrefutable proof that survival itself could pivot on something once so blithely considered trivial. Evans most keenly observed this profound shift in perception whenever fresh replacements arrived. These fresh-faced young boys, straight out of basic training, would eye the pistols with the same deep-seated doubt he himself had once harbored. The seasoned veterans, however, offered few words. They simply handed over spare magazines, allowing the brutal realities of the islands to impart their own grim lessons. Those lessons often arrived with terrifying swiftness, as they did on Saipan. One replacement froze, paralyzed by fear, when his rifle jammed in the face of a charging enemy, only to be violently yanked aside by Evans, who coolly emptied his Colt into the on-rushing foe. The boy's wide-eyed, stunned silence afterward spoke volumes. No verbal explanation was necessary. The Japanese, now desperate and ferociously driven, retaliated with renewed fury. Their Banzai charges became even more reckless, their night assaults more frantic and unhinged. They continued to wield their bayonets with unwavering pride, yet the underlying certainty that had once fueled their mocking laughter had irrevocably vanished. Where they had once scoffed with contempt, they now braced themselves with a palpable dread. They had witnessed too many comrades collapse mid-stride, cut down by a weapon they had so foolishly dismissed. Irony, acrid and suffocating, clung to the war like persistent smoke. The very sidearm they had so scornfully labeled a toy had, in the chilling darkness, transformed into their most profound nightmare. By Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Colt had ascended to the status of a grim legend. The very landscape, the stark black sands and intricate volcanic tunnels, seemed to magnify its fearsome reputation. Evans descended into the subterranean darkness of the caves with his pistol already drawn, each careful step echoing ominously against the unforgiving stone. Muzzle flashes momentarily carved brief, violent murals onto the rock walls. Men silhouetted, dust swirling chaotically, eyes burning with a primal intensity. When he finally emerged back into the blinding daylight, his ears ringing from the concussive blasts, he carried with him an unshakable certainty. The pistol, it seemed, had been meticulously designed for this exact war, as though fate itself had presciently anticipated this brutal struggle decades in advance. Yet, despite its proven power, the pistol could not shoulder the entire burden alone. Its magazine remained small, its weight a constant, draining presence. Soldiers now joked grimly, "The Colt will save you, but only 7 times." This was the razor's edge they constantly walked, profound confidence tempered by inherent limitation. Nevertheless, even those precious 7 chances meant everything. Evans often pondered the fate of the men who had once scoffed at the pistol years earlier. Did they, in their final desperate moments, comprehend the profound error of their judgment? Did they ever truly grasp the terrible cost of underestimating a piece of steel shaped by brutal experience rather than by rigid tradition? The undeniable turning point had been reached. The Colt was no longer mocked, no longer dismissed with doubt. It was now universally feared, profoundly respected, and irrevocably woven into the very rhythm of island warfare as surely as the thunderous roar of artillery or the soft whisper of waves against the shore. For Evans, it served as both a shield and a haunting shadow, a constant reminder that survival emerged not solely from innate courage, but also from the cold, uncompromising precision of a weapon built specifically to stop. The pistol had been utterly transformed. From a simple joke into a definitive verdict, its voice utterly unanswerable in the suffocating close quarters of the Pacific. And yet, as the brutal war relentlessly ground forward, a chilling question persistently remained. If one pistol could so fundamentally alter the rhythm of battle, what profound significance would it hold when the final island was confronted? When the monumental struggle reached its ultimate, earth-shattering crescendo? Evans, though profoundly weary, remained utterly unbroken, knowing with grim certainty that the Colt would indeed be there, too, steadfastly articulating its blunt, undeniable truth. But even he could not yet know how profoundly its voice would echo, shaping destinies long after the war neared its end. Some designs transcend time not due to fleeting trends, but because they are forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. By the war's conclusion, the Colt 45 had become far more than just a firearm. It was a steadfast companion, an indelible symbol, and for countless individuals, the stark distinction between succumbing to silence and claiming survival. The Pacific Islands, unforgiving and brutal, had seared this truth deep into the souls of the men who carried it. Charles Evans returned from that crucible with the familiar weight of its steel still imprinted on his hip, even though the holster was gone and the conflict was a world away. Yet, in the landscapes of memory, it remained an ever-present force. Years later, when he spoke of the war, his narrative seldom dwelled on grand strategies or the feats of generals. Instead, he recounted tales of the pistol that had abruptly silenced laughter, the weapon that had met a desperate charge with unyielding finality, fundamentally reshaping his understanding of what it truly meant to endure. The Colt's enduring legacy was etched in the sweat, smoke, and profound silence of those battles. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, men confronted the grim reality that survival often hinged on fighting at distances where their breath mingled with the chilling embrace of fear. Rifles, despite their impressive range and formidable power, often proved cumbersome and ineffective in the labyrinthine confines of caves and dense thickets. It was precisely in these unforgiving spaces that the Colt thrived, asserting its dominance. The pistol held a mere 7 rounds in its magazine, yet each projectile struck with a devastating authority that no adversary could ever hope to disregard. A soldier might stagger on through grievous wounds from smaller calibers, but a single 45 round invariably put an end to the argument, delivering an undeniable, brutal truth. The Japanese, who had initially scoffed, later recorded in their diaries their profound astonishment. Some wrote bitterly of comrades falling instantly, as if struck down by an invisible, relentless force. Others, with grudging respect, acknowledged the weapon's terrifying efficacy. The pistol that had once been dismissed as a joke transformed into a haunting shadow, relentlessly pursuing their charges. Yet, the truth of war is not solely measured in the chilling grip of fear. It is also found in the quiet, poignant reflections of those who survived. Evans distinctly recalled the bone-jarring recoil in his hand, the way it jolted his wrist and sent a ringing sensation through his ears. He remembered how, in the aftermath, his hand would tremble, not from weakness, but from the immense burden of comprehending the monumental decision contained within that single, decisive shot. For him, the Colt's legacy transcended its raw stopping power. It was about how it stripped battle down to its starkest essence. One man, one weapon, one solitary chance. In those desperate moments, history was not a grand, sweeping strategy, but a sudden flash of light and the metallic echo of steel. This profound legacy resonated far beyond Evans himself. Veterans across the Pacific theater carried their memories into peacetime, and when they spoke, the pistol was often a central, unspoken character. Some extolled its unwavering reliability in the mud and incessant rain. Others lauded the absolute certainty it offered when facing an enemy charge. Even those who seldom fired it still meticulously polished it, cleaned it, and kept it close, a silent acknowledgement of its role as an indispensable, unspoken partner. Letters sent home, personal memoirs, and oral histories consistently reiterated the same refrain. The Colt worked precisely when nothing else did. It was not elegant, perhaps, but it was unyieldingly faithful. In war, that was more than enough to forge a legend. Historians often point out that this formidable pistol emerged from an earlier, equally brutal conflict, the Philippine-American War, where smaller caliber weapons had proven tragically insufficient against determined, fanatical charges. John Browning's genius design was a direct, definitive answer to that failure, offering brute certainty. Decades later, in the steaming jungles and coral atolls of the Pacific, his solution once again unequivocally proved its worth. That continuity, that enduring thread of an ingenious design meeting and mastering the harsh realities of combat, became an integral part of the Colt's mystique. Soldiers who carried it into World War II felt, even if they couldn't articulate the precise details, an innate sense that their weapon had already been thoroughly tested by fire and found unequivocally worthy. It was almost as if the pistol itself carried memory, a silent whisper that it had confronted doubt before and had undeniably survived. The Japanese, deeply steeped in ancient traditions of finely crafted steel and indomitable spirit, encountered in the Colt a starkly different philosophy. Function prioritized over form, decisive finality over flamboyant flourish. Their bayonets gleamed, their blades curved with centuries of martial history. But against the blunt, uncompromising certainty of the .45, such cherished traditions faltered, often violently. The pistol's legacy was not merely in its elegant mechanics, but in what it profoundly symbolized. A fundamental shift in the very nature of warfare, where industrial design intersected with ancient courage, and the machine often, chillingly, prevailed. It was a sobering, brutal lesson, one etched deeply into diaries and lived out in profound silence by those who had once laughed. In his later years, Evans would sometimes retrieve his scarred and aged sidearm from a drawer where it had long rested. One evening, he showed it to his grandson, the boy's eyes wide with wonder as he cradled the cold steel in his small hands. "It's heavy," the child whispered, awe in his voice. Evans simply nodded. "It was meant to be," he replied softly. He spared the boy the grim details, the desperate faces, the frenzied charges, the suffocating darkness of the caves. He simply offered, "It kept me alive." That was the Colt's legacy, distilled into words a child could grasp. Behind them lay all the echoing cries of the jungles, the profuse sweat of the islands, and the terrifying silence that followed laughter. The weapon's formidable endurance stretched far beyond the cessation of hostilities. It remained standard issue for the U.S. military until 1985, carried faithfully through Korea, Vietnam, and numerous conflicts beyond, even as newer designs emerged. Many units stubbornly clung to it, unwilling to relinquish the reassuring weight of its certainty. Special forces operators, seasoned veterans, and discerning collectors alike instinctively recognized that some tools do not truly age. They simply prove their unwavering worth again and again. To hold a Colt .45 was to feel the palpable weight of history resting in one's palm, to sense the profound legacy of a design that had unflinchingly outlasted every shadow of doubt. Yet, legacies are not solely about survival. They are profoundly about transformation. For Evans, the pistol fundamentally reshaped his entire worldview of war. He had entered the Pacific theater with a healthy dose of skepticism, mocking whispers of the weapon's power still echoing in his mind. He departed irrevocably convinced that no weapon, however seemingly simple, should ever be underestimated. The Colt had taught him, with brutal clarity, that laughter could vanish in a single, terrifying heartbeat, replaced by a silence that could stretch for a lifetime. Its lesson was harsh, undeniable, but it endured. Never dismiss what you do not truly understand. The pistol's physical weight was more than mere steel. It was the unyielding burden of proof, carried in every soldier's hand. As the war's epic stories slowly transitioned into history, the Colt became a revered relic, carefully displayed in glass cases, its aged frame reflecting the sterile lights of museums. Visitors would read the informative plaques detailing its design, its service record, its cold statistics. But the veterans who stood before it saw so much more. They saw the looming jungle shadows, the sudden flash of a muzzle, the precise moment when laughter died. They remembered the indelible echo that had followed them all the way home, the pistol's unyielding, resolute voice. To the general public, it was merely a piece of machinery. To those who had carried it, it was memory, fiercely forged in iron. Some designs are truly timeless. The helmet that steadfastly shielded foreheads, the ubiquitous jeep that fearlessly traversed mud and treacherous terrain, the Colt 45 that decisively silenced mockery. Its legacy was not rooted in glory, but in a grim, hard-earned respect. It resided in the way it inexorably turned laughter into fear, doubt into an unshakable trust, and the raw act of survival into an undeniable testimony. Evans, as he grew older, understood this truth completely, his memories perhaps fading but never truly gone. He often spoke little of the war, but when gently pressed, he would murmur, "The pistol told the truth." And that truth was final, immutable, as unchanging as the steel itself. The war had ended, yet the profound echoes of the Colt remained. They lingered in the hushed stories told by veterans, in the grudging respect of enemies who had once laughed, in the visceral weight of history that could still be felt in its grip. It was more than a weapon, it was a verdict. And though the battles had long ceased, its voice would still be heard, quiet, yet enduring, reminding all who listened that some designs are timeless because, ultimately, they simply cannot be ignored.